Hello, my name is Sierra McMurray. This video is discussing basal area. We will be diving into how we measure it, how differently it can look in different forests, and why it is so important to wildlife. Let's first define basal area. It is defined as a cross-section of a tree at breast height. To measure basal area, we look at the sum of the basal areas of all the trees in a specific area. It is measured in either feet squared per acre or meters squared per hectare. Basal area is a metric used by foresters and wildlife biologists. Basal area generally represents the amount of tree stems in a stand, the amount of canopy cover, and the potential amount of sunlight reaching the ground. A lower basal area typically means that there is more light reaching the ground to support understory plants. Now we'll talk about how to measure basal area using a couple of tools. I will show you how to use a prism and an angle gauge to measure basal area. You will also need a DBH measuring tape. For the angle gauge, place yourself at the center of a stand. Put the end of the chain to your mouth and choose one of the basal area factors. You have the option for 5, 10, 20, and 40. Choose a factor that will allow you to measure at least 7 to 10 trees. When holding up the angle gauge, you will do a full 360-degree turn and measure which trees fit inside the factor of your choosing. If you can see the edge of the tree and it does not fill up your angle gauge, it will not be included in your measurement. You take the amount of trees you tallied times your basal area factor to get you basal area per acre. The smaller the tree, the smaller factor you will need. Now, if you're using a prism, there is an offset on the lens. It will take the tree and offset it just a little bit. If the tree trunk is offset enough where there is no intersection, you exclude that tree. If there is an intersection, even the smallest amount, you would count that tree in. A 10-factor prism measures in standard units rather than metric, so each tree measured as N is represented as 10 feet squared per acre, and not meters squared per hectare. For the angle gauge, you are centering yourself within the stand and doing a 360-degree turn. However, if you're using a prism, your prism is actually the plot center, so you have to center around the prism and move your body to count the trees. Measuring basal area across an entire forest would take a substantial amount of time, so we can instead do many samples to estimate the mean and range of basal area and the area of interest. Now, let's look at how the same basal area measurement can look so different in different forested sites. Although basal area is a good surrogate for canopy cover and the potential for understory structure, it's not perfect. In fact, two different stands with the same basal area may have vastly different structures. This dense stand of many small diameter seedlings has approximately the same basal area as the stand with relatively few large diameter trees. Even though the area of the cross-section of the trees adds up to the same value in the two stands, the area of the cross-sections is spread across many trees in the stand and across relatively few trees in the other stand. This first stand has relatively high canopy cover and low light penetration to the ground, whereas the second stand has much more open canopy and more light penetration. Why is basal area ecologically significant? Basal area is generally correlated with light penetration to the forest floor. Light will affect the vegetation structure and what wildlife species can persist in these areas. Now, let's talk about wildlife. If an area has a lower basal area, we typically see more light penetrating to the forest floor. We can assume that because of greater light availability, there would be greater understory vegetation which offers food and cover for many animals, including species like white-tailed deer. If an area's basal area is higher, we would assume light is less likely to penetrate through the tree canopy. This would mean less understory, so food and cover near the ground would be sparse. Many biologists will use basal area as a predictive metric for whether a forested area provides habitat. Bobwhite quail is a great example of a species that is closely linked to tree basal area. Typically, bobwhite avoid areas with basal area that is greater than 50 feet squared per acre, especially when that basal area is concentrated on many small diameter stems. However, salamanders favor cool, moist microclimates and relatively dense leaf litter. We can predict that salamanders would typically favor forests with relatively high basal area and high canopy cover that shade the forest floor and produce lots of litter. Lastly, let's talk about management and timber harvest. Timber harvest reduces basal area, either to create more growing space for residual crop trees, as is the case with commercial thinning, or to foster favorable light conditions for regeneration of targeted tree species. Reduction of basal area to a specific target condition may also be used to create or improve habitat for a focal wildlife species, such as northern bobwhite or white-tailed deer. In summary, basal area is an important metric for understanding forest density and related canopy cover, which can greatly impact the wildlife species that use forest or woodland as habitat. Thank you.